interesting question because people say I planned all my life to become national security advisor and get into public life, but the fact is I didn't know Nixon when I was appointed, and but I had studied a lot of history. This is really how I formed my basic views, through experiences in a totalitarian state as a child, serving in military service during the war, and then reading a lot of history. No stage in my life could I ever have anticipated that this would happen. At no stage, not even when I was made National Security Advisor. And I think it is a great symptom of the strength of America that this was even conceivable. For my parents, who had come through the Nazi persecution, it was a miraculous event. And now that I look back on it, I too am somewhat in awe of it. At the time that I went through it, I was too busy to reflect on it. I'd never met Nixon when he appointed me. And in fact, when he appointed me, I had the colossal arrogance to say, I've opposed you for 12 years, and I'd like to have a week to consult my friends because I don't want to lose them as a result of working for you. And it's a tribute to Nixon that he didn't tell me to disappear at that point. And but this is how it happened. But I have to say one thing about Nixon. In terms of personality and background, we were not well matched. Richard Nixon, for a politician, had the extraordinary quality that he really didn't like to meet new people. And he did not like to exchange views with individuals who might disagree with him. So therefore, he confined his circle of advisors to a very small group and used me as the intermediary to do the day-to-day, almost presidential work on that level. And secondly, in the period of Watergate, there was an instinctive rallying around the one symbol of foreign policy that existed. And for a couple of years, I benefited in terms of my own position. And finally, there was something that Raymond Aron always used to say to me. He always said to me, you should pray for the survival of Nixon because you are the press's alibi for their hatred of Nixon. And as soon as he goes, your privileged position will disappear. And he was right, as always. Nixon, as any president would, and maybe he even more, was on the one hand resentful. But on the other hand, he respected whatever contribution I made, and he never made a serious, visible effort anyway to push me out of the policy-making process. What he wanted from Rogers was what Clinton got from Christopher. He wanted a negotiator, somebody who would run the State Department for him, but he did not want a policymaker. If anything went wrong, on the basis of some advice I received but didn't pass on, my position would have been disastrous. And I believe when the NSC documents all become available, it will be seen that I made a fair presentation to the President of other points of view. And you have to remember that the way to deal with Nixon, or at least that I learned after a few weeks to deal with Nixon, was by memorandum, because if I talked to him, I suffered the same uncertainty as everybody else, that he could not overrule you to your face. But he had no difficulty doing it on paper. So after the first few weeks, once I understood that personality trait, almost all my substantive communications with Nixon were by memorandum, most of which are coming out now. My power also derived from this fact. The the cabinet members, when they disagreed with Nixon, they didn't tackle him directly. They didn't write a long memo opposing it. What they tried to do is use bureaucratic methods to undercut what he was doing by not carrying it out or leaking or carrying it out partially. And the result was that he became more and more distrustful of them. So there was an interplay because Nixon was highly intelligent and he knew when his orders were or were not carried out. Well, I think you're exaggerating somewhat what my omnipotence allegedly was. First of all, there was a great team spirit on the NSC, and most of the key people remained friends through all the intervening period. Within the White House, it was an odd conglomerate of people. You had a number of people like Haldeman and Ehrlichman who had been with Nixon during his years in the wilderness and who had not been on the national political scene before, nor were they tied into the intellectual community as I was. And so it was culturally difficult for us, not so much that my omnipotence, but my omnipotence was the result, not the cause of this. But you have to remember, when I first worked for Nixon, I was an obscure figure. I became prominent in July 1971 on the basis of my secret trip to China. Before that, I was a figure for the cognoscenti and for the Washington press corps. Then I suddenly emerged with tremendous visibility. And then when Watergate started, that visibility was accelerated. Of course, Nixon was uneasy about that. I would say most other presidents would have fired an advisor who played such a visible role. The anti-Semitic comments, I haven't seen any tape in which he made these comments in my presence. And so some of it was surprising to me when it came out. But on the other hand, those of us who worked with Nixon knew not to take seriously everything he said when he was under stress. A lot of it was posturing, a lot of it was just an emotional outburst, because he did have also an unusual number of people of the Jewish faith in his entourage. And I don't think that he was genuinely anti-Semitic. He had some of the social prejudices of Orange County, but I don't consider him anti-Semitic. Well, that's a long, complicated story, because when I first had contact with Vietnam in 1965, when I was invited to be consultant to Ambassador Lodge. And I concluded that the war could not be won, certainly not the way we were fighting it. But of course I was in no position to do anything about this until 1969, when I became security advisor. And I wrote an article in Foreign Affairs in 1968 in which I indicated the strategy I thought that should be followed, namely to separate the political and the military component, and for the United States to settle the military component and leave the political side to the Vietnamese. But once you've made the conclusion that you should withdraw, you then face the difficulty of how to do it when you find 550,000 people in place. I mean, it took de Gaulle 5 years, just about as long as it took us, to extricate France from Algeria. And one of the reasons this is so difficult is because while you still have large forces on the ground, you have to do it in a way that the surrounding circumstances do not get totally out of control. One of the problems about the Vietnam War is this. I understand the people who were opposed to the Vietnam War. on the ground that it wasn't winnable, and that. But there has been an absolutely systematic distortion or lack of willingness to face the truth. We made our proposal at the basic proposal that was not modified and only improved in January 1972. It was publicized in 1972 as an attachment to President Nixon's speech of the end of January. It was approved by President Thieu. In early October 1972, the North Vietnamese accepted an improved version of what had been published and had not been objected to. So to say we were chancing South Vietnam's survival is one of these ex post facto analysis. Once you leave, as the basic mistake, if there was one, was not the agreement, but the agreement to withdraw American forces altogether. It was the only allied country of whom we have ever asked that. Now then, Vietnam collapsed 2 years later, partly because the Congress every year cut its aid by 50%, so that the one advantage the South Vietnamese had, which was superior firepower, disappeared. Ammunition was rationed, missions of the Air Force were limited, and this produced a gradual demoralization, which finally culminated in the fact that the Congress, which had promised a supplementary budget of $400 million to be approved in January of 75, suddenly refused to approve it. And a combination of all these circumstances, plus intrinsic weaknesses, caused the eventual collapse. The war was extended to Cambodia by the Vietnamese. The Vietnamese put 4 divisions into Cambodia. When Nixon came in, there were he had 400 to 500 dead a week, mostly coming from the Cambodian sanctuaries. Therefore, to bomb the Cambodian sanctuaries was a normal reaction. Secondly, the ruler of Cambodia on many occasions publicly stated, once to an emissary of President Johnson, several times in press conferences, that he did not object to anything that was directed against what he called the Viet Minh on his territory, as long as no Cambodians were killed. And I have those quotes, and I can get them for you. I didn't bring them. No, Congress was, well, it's not even true that Congress was not consulted, because 20 top leaders of the Congress were told about it, and not one of them said you have to bring this to the whole Congress. But the end of the war was a very sad day for me, because it was the collapse of 10 years of huge effort by the United States, and it had torn our country apart, and it was ending in a somewhat ignominious fashion. Well, I regret the outcome of the Vietnam War. I don't know what could have been done to avoid it, given what the domestic circumstances were. And, you know, I'm going to learn a good answer to that question someday, because it would make me look more humble and more human if I said those things we really screwed up. The fact is that, first, I thought about these problems a long time. Secondly, I operated maybe too mechanically, conceptually. So we had a group of top advisors who met almost every morning to analyze where we should be and what we should be doing and whether we were doing it. So not everything we did succeeded, but the terrible thing is, if you ask me would I do it over again, most of it I would do over again. Nobody took Sadat seriously, and I thought he was a character out of Aida who kept making threatening noises and never did anything. So the fact that he constantly kept threatening war and constantly making deadlines was not particularly taken seriously, because nobody believed that the Arab armies had any chance of sustaining themselves, even for a few days, against the Israelis. Secondly, on the Israeli side, they were worried about a high visibility Secretary of State addressing the peace problem, for fear that this would lead to pressure on them. So there was a vested interest in Israel not to create too much fear of war in America. When I became Secretary of State, I understood for the first time that the Department of State has its own intelligence unit, which I frankly didn't know. I hadn't looked at the organization. So one Saturday, the first Saturday I was in office, in fact, I asked the INR Bureau, which is the title for this group, to let me see some of their reports so that I could judge what my assets were. And I received these reports, and they spoke of significant Egyptian and Syrian concentrations on their respective fronts. I called the CIA for a report, what that meant. The CIA went to the Israeli intelligence, asked them what they meant, what it meant. The Israeli intelligence was afraid to give me material I could use to justify a peace offensive. So they poo-pooed it. I asked them to get a report every 2 days. And they said, yes, they're concentrations, they're normal maneuvers, don't mean anything. And I think that was their honest view. Then on the Thursday before the attack occurred, the Soviet dependents were pulled out of Syria and Egypt. And again, our intelligence assessment was that this was as a result of some quarrel between Russia and Egypt and Syria. And nobody asked what, to me, in retrospect, is the obvious question: what possible issue could produce a dispute between Egypt and Syria simultaneously, and Russia and Soviet Union, sufficient to cause the removal of Soviet troops? Well, we never asked the question, so we never got that analysis. So it is in that context that the attack came as a complete surprise. And anyway, in any event, when the first intelligence assessment took place after the attack, it was the conviction of most present that this was an Israeli-induced maneuver. At that point, I drew the line and said, they thought Israel was the aggressor. I said, the one thing I guarantee you, Israel is not launch an aggressive war on Yom Kippur. There were some disagreements in which he had a good case, namely that I did not give him enough information. That was not about the war, but in general. There he was right. But on the Middle East, his version of events is grotesque, because an almost total reversal of the truth is the one that is being presented by the Pentagon people. The Pentagon, for very understandable reasons, did not want to resupply Israel, and if so, at an absolute minimum level, because they had bases in Muslim countries, and they valued their relationships in Saudi Arabia and Turkey and elsewhere, and they did not want to jeopardize it in a conflict with on behalf of Israel that they thought Israel would probably win anyway. So fundamentally, the Pentagon was dragging its feet. And what I was trying to do at first was to use the civil air fleet. It had not occurred to me to use the military airlift. And also one has to remember another thing. The war started on a Saturday morning. The first time we heard that there was a problem was on Tuesday morning, when the Israelis told us that Golda Meir wanted to come to Washington and plead for aid. And I felt that for her to come in the middle of a war was a sign of such panic that it would excessively weaken her, and I told her not to come, and that we would replace all their losses after the war. Then it turned out that they needed help during the war. So we explored a civilian air fleet. This, for a variety of reasons, many of them Pentagon-induced, was stymied for about 36 hours, and then Nixon just ordered to go with the military airlift. I know the opposite version. It just doesn't happen to be true. This is not a case where you can have different perceptions if you have access to all the information. I don't accept this distinction between realpolitik and values. Now you say we support a most repressive regime. I think the Shah of Iran was a big step forward in human rights compared to the Khomeini regime. Or the Khomeini regime was a huge step back, and yet I notice a lot of democracies are urging better relations with Iran on the ground that it is just too important a country to leave in isolation. And on the whole, I agree with this point of view. The people who say this also always imply the Cold War was sort of an accident, didn't really happen. But there was a Cold War, and there was a strategic problem, and you have to judge what statesmen do in relation to their alternatives. What should we have done in Iran? It's now fashionable to say Mossadegh was a great option. I don't know anyone who thought it at the time. And I was not in government at the time, so I have no vested interest in that. My view of Pinochet was that he was, from the global point of view, an improvement over Allende, because we thought that Allende was determined to establish a Castroid type of set of institutions in Chile. I did not approve many of the methods that Pinochet used, and I said so to him on the occasion that I met him. On the other hand, we welcomed the overthrow of Pinochet, of Allende. It was not done against our preference, but it was essentially done without our knowledge. When I first heard of the Watergate crisis, Haldeman and Ehrlichman told me there was absolutely nothing to it. You have to remember, in the Nixon White House, and the tapes have now confirmed this, there was an absolute separation between domestic and foreign policy. So I never participated in the domestic discussions, and they never participated in the national security discussions. And at first I didn't take it very seriously, and I was told not to take it very seriously. Then it kept going on and on and on. But I did not take seriously that this was a major crisis until about end of March 1973, nearly a year afterwards, when I made a public speech asking for national reconciliation. And Len Garment, one of Nixon's lawyers, came to see me the next day, and he said, "Are you out of your mind?" He said, "This is going to turn into the biggest scandal that this country has ever seen." And then I knew we were in a huge crisis. Irrevocable, I thought, took me another year to get to that point, that I thought, in fact, Nixon would have to go. I finally advised him to do so, but only 2 days before he resigned. Once the tape came out, was a cabinet meeting which Nixon attempted to conduct as if nothing had happened, and a whole series of cabinet members spoke about more or less suggesting resignation, or at any rate dissociating from him. And I was the senior cabinet member as Secretary of State, and I put an end to the discussion. I said, we're not here to do anything other than follow the president's agenda, which is this situation. Then after it was over, I held a press conference and I said, no matter what happens, we will have a coherent foreign policy. And from that, I went to the president's office and told him that whatever my public position, the time had come for him to think seriously about whether he could carry this on. You see, I believe that Nixon did things that were wrong in Watergate, but I think his persecutors drove it totally out of any proportion to the actual wrong that he did. So, what is the lesson for the future? Of course, the easy thing to say, and it's true, is that the president is bound by law. But it started a process in which of the criminalization of the political process, which is becoming more and more widespread, and which I see has now also spread to France, and which makes public service extremely dangerous. And I think Nixon was rightly condemned for many of the actions he undertook, but he was punished beyond his deserts.